joining us here on Fresh Outlook. I'm Mia Toski. We know you have a lot of choices as to how you can spend your hours, so we thank you for choosing us to spend your time with. We have a busy show for you this week. We will be talking about the latest in the Syrian crisis. We will also be talking about Monday's horrific mass shooting at the D.C. Navy base that left 13 people dead. It's raised impassioned but misguided calls for more gun control laws. The FBI released new statistics that show murders with firearms are actually down between 2008 and 2012. We'll talk about that and also ask the question, who will be the next Fed chairman? And finally, we will have our lightning round where we will talk about everything from the Occupy Wall Street movement, the new iPhone 5 craze, and a big snub at this year's Emmy Awards. But first, the Syrian crisis. For some weeks, the world's attention has turned from the brutal civil war that continues to rage over much of the country and focus instead on the use of chemical weapons near Damascus. After several bewildering political turns, Syria has now handed over information about its chemical arsenal to a UN-backed weapons watchdog, meeting the first deadline of its ambitious disarmament operation that averted the threat of Western airstrikes. Let's have a look at the latest news.
The UN has confirmed that there is clear and convincing evidence chemical weapons were used in Syria. The report left the key question of who launched the attack unanswered. Russia's foreign minister says he will give the UN Security Council evidence implicating Syrian rebels in last month's chemical attack near Damascus.
We have enough evidence that information about chemical weapons use reflects the fact that the opposition regularly resorts to provocation in order to bring in strikes.
In sharp contrast, Britain, France, and the U.S. say it confirmed Syria's government was behind it and not the rebels, as Russia suggests.
This fight about Syria's chemical weapons is not a game. It's real. It's important. It's important to the lives of people in Syria. It's important to the region. It's important to the world that this be enforced.
In an interview with Fox News, Syrian President Bashar Assad said the U.S. could destroy his chemical weapons stockpile if the Obama administration is willing to pay for the cost of doing so and to take the toxic material to the U.S.
If the American administration is ready to pay those money and to take the responsibility of bringing toxic materials to the United States, why don't they do it?
Meanwhile, in Syria, intense shelling and explosions continued this week. The fighting devastated large areas of the 3 million Syria's former business capital, forcing thousands of residents to leave. Nationwide, the United Nations estimates 7 million people, about a third of Syria's pre-war population, have been forced to leave their homes.
We now welcome our distinguished panel of former White House aide Didi Benke, political psychologist Dr. Bart Rossi, and Dr. Dalia Fahmy, professor of political science at Long Island University. Thank you all for joining us. Well, we've been talking about Syria for quite some weeks now, and I think there's a somewhat of a collective sigh of relief that it looks like Western airstrikes have been averted. But let's talk about this week. Didi, we're going to start with you. Just give me a little roundabout and tell me where you stand. We just heard of Bashar al-Assad saying that the U.S. Could take that chemical arsenal if they were willing to pay.
Well, going back to when we first started talking about this, I remember saying that, of course, Congress is not going to support this, and Obama at least astutely saw that, so went to Russia to try to help and get a lifeline, which he did. So now here we are. People, we are trying to work on getting rid of the chemical weapons, but is that really happening? You know, that's the big question. They hand over a piece of paper to the UN, but does it really mean anything? Is that report true, or have they moved them, or is that really the case? So I don't know. I think it's highly suspect.
And of course, the billions of dollars it would cost to move that arsenal of chemical weapons. Dr. Fahmy, your thoughts?
Well, I think we have to understand that, yes, we did kind of all breathe a sigh of relief this week when President Bashar al-Assad agreed to the destruction of his chemical weapons. And now Syria's moved off our front pages down to page 6 in terms of our interests. But we have to think about this in a more broad spectrum. We have continued to think about Syria through conventional means as state actors, as if the only way we can think about Syria is if there's either airstrikes or not. And what were the airstrikes all about anyway? It was to prove a point. You crossed some sort of red line, and so you're going to be punished for it. But what's become unclear is we actually don't have a clear strategy on Syria. And we don't have a clear strategy because we don't understand that just talking about chemical weapons averts the attention of over 1 million people killed in this conflict, 4 million people displaced within Syria, 2 million people displaced outside of Syria, and so we are actually not talking about the real issues because we have yet to formulate a clear strategy on Syria.
Well, we are going to talk about the real issues here on Fresh Outlook. But Dr. Bart Rossi, just I think in terms of here in the U.S., I think a lot of people obviously were against any kind of action, any kind of military action. So I do think that there was a sigh of relief, and certainly from the American people.
From the American people and from the president. I think I said before on this show, this is a classic approach avoidance conflict, as psychologists call it. We really think about doing something, but we really don't want to do anything at all. And I think the voice of the public was ringing out. I also thought the president was very thoughtful. Some people said that he acted like a community organizer. Peter King in New York, I think that's very wrong. I think the president actually handled this about as well as you can handle an approach avoidance conflict that is very complicated. So I think that's what happened.
Let's go back to what is happening in Syria. And Dr. Fahmy, there's so many different factions, and I think that's one of the problems about this whole Syrian crisis. There's so many different factions within Syria, between Iran, between Hezbollah, between Saudi Arabia, and of course the most dangerous element being Al-Qaeda. How do we move forward from here?
Well, we're talking about addressing Syria in terms of these parties that have emerged even more recently. The Free Syrian Army, the Syrian Liberation Front, these are all things that have come in the past year. If we remember the beginnings of this revolution, the revolution began by young people that crossed all religious lines, all ideological lines. It was Druze, Muslims, Christians, Alawites, who were actually pushing for greater freedom. The beginning of the revolution began when 15 students spray painted freedom on their school wall. And so we need to go back and think, what happened to that nonviolent resistance? It is still there. There's a huge segment of the Syrian population that is still committed to nonviolent resistance that we as an international community continue to undermine. Addressing Syria is not about arming the Free Syrian Army. It's actually about going to those who started the revolution, calling for freedom and democracy, and seeing what their needs are. Today their needs are in terms of supporting them in terms of a free press, providing for them medical aid. They're actually providing alternate schools for children there. And so if we as an international community of humans actually look at the humanitarian level, what Syria actually needs, it's not the Band-Aid situation of training the Free Syrian Army in Jordan by the CIA, or actually giving them arms, or talking about the destruction of chemical weapons.
Well, probably right now, I think most of us would agree that the humanitarian crisis right now, getting food to the folks not only in Syria but in neighboring Turkey, is probably one of the greatest challenges.
We're not talking about simply giving aid, understanding that there is a very strong resistance movement within Syria that needs support. And so we tend to think of this in terms of black boxes: the Free Syrian Army, the Syrian Liberation Front, Al-Qaeda and foreign fighters versus a Syrian regime. There's actually many more actors that actually need our attention. So we don't reduce this to something of a civil war, not recognizing that the revolution continues today in Syria.
Okay, I want to get your thoughts about how we do address this. Didi?
Well, obviously it's very complex. I mean, when you get into Syria, but as Americans like, you know what, I'm sorry, we have our own complex issues. That's what's going on. People don't understand it, and so no one wants to go. So that's what's happening here. So now I think all Americans are good about the humanitarian aid, but are they going to want to pay for it? Are they going to want to move the weapons? Does anyone believe they're really going to give them up? No, polls show that. So everyone in America just thinks it's a mess. Unfortunately, our president looks weak. He did not handle it well at all. He handled it miserably. Our country now looks weaker than it's ever looked in the Middle East, or at least since the 70s. And now we propped up Putin, which was a terrible mistake. But at least, if there's a way that it can help give aid and it can help bring in the chemical weapons or take them away, fine. But I don't know, it's still highly suspect. And now it's left to the UN. Well, good luck with that.
Well, let me talk about why Syria has such a stockpile of chemical weapons. I mean, that's certainly a big question. Bashar al-Assad admitted on several television programs this past week that there are weapons, but says President Obama's red line is something that does not pertain to Syria. Dee Dee?
What? I'm sorry. No, you know, the red line, of course, was set a long time ago and nothing was done, and all of a sudden, ooh, hey, it's the red line. What are we going to do? Let's strike. And then he got struck down by Congress, and it's just been one mistake after another, after another, after another. So I don't believe anything President Obama says right now about it. Don't believe anything that Assad says right now, or Putin. It's just a big mess.
Well, let's go back to Syria. Obviously, this is complicated and a lot of different opinions here in the U.S., but going back to just the problems and the stockpile of weapons in Syria, Dr. Fahmy?
Well, Syria has had chemical weapons for decades. It's not a very recent problem. They've had it for decades. But we also have to look at this in the context of our relationship with Syria as the United States. The United States in the 40s and 50s tried to have 2 coups in Syria. The United States was actually part of the coup that led to the bringing about of Hafez al-Assad into power. Our record with Syria is actually not too great in terms of saying we support democracy but actually supporting an authoritarian dictator. In the post-9/11 world, the United States sent most of our terror suspect and political prisoners to Syria for torture. And so for us to actually say that we're committed to these notions of democracy is problematic, especially in the eyes of the Syrian people who saw 2 years of inaction on behalf of the international community. And the only talks of action have been in terms of these pockets of supporting rebel groups. If we were really committed, what we would have done is, as soon as the revolution began, and within a few months when Bashar Assad started bombing his own people, we should have had a no-fly zone. We didn't do that.
Well, and I think President Obama was certainly scrutinized as to why he waited for so long. Many folks that I've talked to who have a family in Syria have said they couldn't understand why the U.S. had waited and sat in the back.
Well, there was a point when Assad was weak. He could have been taken out. If President Obama would have struck then something could have been done. But now I waited and dithered around and handled it.
I think that thinking I'm completely on the other side of. I think that you have a president who's deliberate, thoughtful.
Deliberate.
He's aggressive against Al-Qaeda. I mean, bin Laden's still dead, in case anybody
Thanks to the Navy SEALs.
Not the president, though, right? No, not having anything to do with him, though, right? So what I'm saying is that we had a George Bush neoconservative approach about being aggressive, and now the country doesn't like that too much. And in Syria, we don't really want to be involved, and with all due respect, I think your points are very well taken, except that they accentuate the complexity of this situation. The more complex it is, I say as a psychologist, how do you solve it? And any president would be criticized for what
if
he's
Doctor, if you could work, you're working at the UN and you're the president. What steps can we take right now?
Because it is complex, airstrikes won't work. Because it is a complex, arming rebels won't work. Because what happens is that you're actually undermining the revolution that's on the ground. What needs to happen is that the international community, not just the United States, but it could be under the leadership of the United States, begins to talk about how do we protect nonviolent civil resistance on the ground, and then that be the red line. That when you bomb innocents, that's the red line.
And let me just ask one last question before we wrap this up. Hassan Rouhani, of course, the new Iranian president, he seems to want to enter into a calmer dialogue about nuclear power. Do you think that this may be an opportunity to work with Iran?
Absolutely. We are entering a time period in our history where forced aggression, or the way we've been thinking about the world conventionally, has come to an end. We need to really engage diplomacy, take advantage of this critical moment, because Iran is watching us very closely.
Thank you very much. We're going to wrap this up. Don't go away, everyone. When we come back, the U.S. has had to confront yet another mass shooting this week. When we come back, we will talk about the Navy Yard tragedy.